Colorado's 7th Congressional District is getting new boundaries and a new voice in Washington. Longtime Democratic Representative Ed Perlmutter is retiring, and the district is redrawn to include Broomfield and Jefferson County, plus mountain communities, Park, Lake, Chaffee, Fremont, Teller, and Custer counties, from the edge of the city to the Continental Divide. Democratic State Senator Brittany Pettersen has focused on support for working families, mental health care, and substance abuse issues. Republican candidate Erik Aadland is an Army combat veteran who went on to work in the oil and gas industry. They debate tonight on Next Presents, the race for Congress.
Thank you for joining us. Kyle Clark alongside Marshall Zellinger. State Senator Brittany Pettersen and Erik Aadland, thank you both for being here to discuss your views with the voters of Colorado. A note for the folks at home, with the exception of that introduction and then our conclusions, this will be the only time that we refer to candidates using any elected or educational titles, because you, as voters, will determine on Election Day who should hold the title U.S. Representative.
Our candidates have agreed to a few ground rules: 45 seconds to answer questions, continued discussion at our discretion, 1-minute closings, and a chance to ask each other a question as we continued respectful dialogue and explore where you agree and disagree.
Let's get started with the issue of government spending and inflation.
Ms. Pettersen, there are several analyses of the Inflation Reduction Act that have determined it will do little to reduce inflation. Would you have voted for the $700 billion package in total, and would you have preferred the $2.2 billion package that was Build Back Better?
Thank you for the question, Marshall. The Inflation Reduction Act is really important in reducing costs for families. It was about investing in long-term savings, so the largest investment that we've had here in Colorado in the United States and in the history of the world for transferring to sustainable energy. That's going to reduce costs over time. It also gives the ability to cap the cost of insulin for seniors and negotiate drug prices with Medicare. So this is not just about, there is some things that we can do to bring jobs back here to the United States with manufacturing, but we need to address rising costs for families. So I would have absolutely supported that.
Is spending the way to reduce inflation?
Thank you for the question. We actually have a duty as the United States to help support our economy in this difficult time. The American Rescue Plan saved our economy. I was able to oversee those dollars, help support our small businesses, making sure that we kept our police departments afloat, as well as our nonprofit organizations across the state. So absolutely, that's why we have a government, to help us in a time of need.
On the flip side, Mr. Aadland, I know you think government should greatly reduce spending. Half of Congress's discretional spending is spent with the military. That's where Congress gets to choose how to spend, half of it with the military, $250 billion. How much spending are you reducing from the military and where?
Well, can I first address the Inflation Reduction Act? Because it does not address inflation whatsoever. In fact, the number one contributing factor to inflation is government spending. We spend outside our cash flow, spend outside our tax revenue. We create a deficit that must be supplemented by printing more money. Well, that becomes a hidden tax on the American people as we inflate the money supply, and every dollar gets devalued. And in fact, Colorado is leading the nation right now in inflation, and it's absolutely absurd. We must address government spending to get a rein on inflation.
So now let's talk about the military.
Now let's talk about the military. The military needs to be well funded and funded efficiently. So we've got to make sure that dollars go to addressing the degradation of our military through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and make sure that we're poised well into the future. And it's a matter of right-sizing government to make sure that spending is efficient and that the military can actually accomplish its mission.
Just one last point on this. So you started that with government spending leads to inflation. Government spending includes military. Cutting it anywhere?
Well, it's about making it more efficient, Marshall. That's what has to be done in all elements of government. Government has become wasteful way beyond its extent. So we've got to fund essential services like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, our national security, including the southern border. But we've got to make sure that it's efficiently spent within our cash flow and look at areas where we can tighten the belt. We've got to make some tough decisions because Coloradans and Americans are suffering because of inflation.
Efficiency. Is there any one area from specifically the military that you think is not being spent efficiently?
Well, I would say how we're sending money around the globe. We've got to look at whether our tax dollars are contributing to American strength and the American people. And we have a national security disaster on the border that's not being addressed, and we're sending excessive funds to countries like Ukraine. Now, I have great compassion for the situation there, but it's got to be done with judicious oversight. Otherwise, Americans will suffer first.
Thank you, Mr. Aadland.
Mr. Aadland, key Republicans in the House are talking about using next year's debt ceiling fight as an opportunity to make cuts to Social Security and to Medicare. So, two-part question. Do you support cuts to Social Security and Medicare benefits? And should the United States risk defaulting on its debt at a time when the economy is in such shaky condition?
Well, the debt ceiling needs to remain so that we force government to operate within the cash flow. Otherwise, inflation will continue to grow out of control, and it's going to hurt the American people and Coloradans. As I mentioned, that 16% inflation rate. Now, I want Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid well-funded, but I want those programs to operate efficiently, and right now they're inefficient. So we need to look at revitalizing those programs, making sure that there's comprehensive reform so the quality does not get compromised and people who are dependent upon those services are not hurt by those efficiencies. But it takes government actually taking a look and reducing the bureaucracy so that those provide the essential services required.
I understand your thought process on this, but I didn't hear an answer to either of the questions. Do you support cuts to Social Security and Medicare?
No, I don't.
You do not, okay. And should the U.S. risk defaulting on its debt at a time when the economy is in this kind of shape? It's going to be the choice of Republicans, because we know the Democrats will vote to increase the debt ceiling.
Well, that's right. And that's where it comes for Congress to actually operate within its purview of the power of the purse, to not raise the debt ceiling, but to make the hard decisions of not just endlessly printing money to supplement a deficit that increases to grow, and that's a direct result of government spending. Congress we have to make cuts somewhere, and we've got to find where to do that.
Question to you on the same topic. So anything you want to say on this topic, you can work into your answer if you'd like. There's pressure on Democrats to raise the debt ceiling in more of a permanent way, like make it so high that this doesn't become a recurring fight that puts the economy in danger. Do you think that we should do that? Would that be a smart thing for Democrats to do before one of you gets to Congress, or in future years when Democrats have control? What do you think about that idea?
We remember a time years ago where this was not put on the negotiating table to potentially not fund our federal government. This has been used as a political ploy, so I think that taking it off the table, I understand what their incentives are for doing so. This actually has an effect on the economy. As you can remember, during Trump, he actually stopped paying our federal employees for months. So I think that some of those irresponsible behaviors have been unfortunately they've taken advantage of this. In Colorado, we actually balance our budget. I understand the need to go in debt for some critical investments, but we do need to evaluate some of the spending and oversight in strategic investments. But just to say really quick,
please.
My opponent has said that he supports McCarthy's plan that would gut Social Security and Medicare. And so I just want to set the record straight there. We also don't have the leading inflation in the United States. We're actually, behind most states in our inflation rate here in Colorado. But this is a global issue. This is something that does affect all of us because of the economic fallout from the pandemic.
So I just want to make sure that we get a clear answer to the question, which is, do you support this idea that Democrats are floating around of moving the debt ceiling so high that it doesn't become a bargaining chip?
I think that this should be off the table. We need to be strategic and responsible with our budget. But the way that this has been politicized is very irresponsible. So yes.
On that inflation number, we talked about this in one of our previous debates, and we're sometimes talking about two different numbers. Right now, the Denver metro area's inflation is at 7% and change, which is actually under the 12-month inflation for the nation as a whole. But Republicans often cite this other number that's 16% if you cherry pick various sectors and look back more than 12 months, not how inflation is commonly measured. So I want people to know what facts and figures you're talking about there. She made a comment about you supporting McCarthy's plan that would result in cuts to Social Security and Medicare. You'd vote against the potential House Speaker's plan?
Well, I've talked to Leader McCarthy at length. That's not part of the commitment to America. There is no effort to reduce funding for Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. We've talked about this, and it's outlined clearly in the commitment to America. I think voters should check this out. This is a plan to get America back on track. It starts with a strong economy, and first and foremost is addressing inflation, because that is the most significant impact on affordability here in Colorado and nationwide.
One more quick question on government spending to both of you, and then we're going to move on to a different topic. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy recently suggested that if Republicans are in charge, they're unlikely to continue the current pace of aid for Ukraine as they try to fight off the Russians. Is now the time to let Ukraine fend for itself with whatever help it can get from the rest of the world?
Well, it's a balanced approach. And we have to articulate our interests in Ukraine before we do anything. I'm a combat veteran, Kyle, and I've seen the horrors of war. I've seen civilian casualties firsthand, and I can empathize with the Ukrainians like nobody else. But we've spent more in Ukraine than Russia's annual spend while we're neglecting a national security disaster on our southern border.
Okay. Do you think we've spent more in Ukraine than we should have already?
I think we've done it with without the right kind of oversight.
Okay.
It's, and that's what we need is judicious oversight in all our spending. Otherwise, just throwing money at a problem and escalating a conflict that is very dangerous, I don't think is the right approach.
You believe that America has escalated the conflict?
I think that we need to be playing a leading role in finding a diplomatic and economic solution as quickly as possible. And we should be shepherding peace talks, and we've done nothing but escalate the problem.
Okay. Do you believe that the United States has done nothing but escalate the problem in Ukraine and is now the time to cut off the Ukrainians from further aid?
This is actually really terrifying when I think about potentially losing the House majority, because McCarthy has committed to taking away that funding that they're relying on right now to fight against the Russian invasion. They are on the forefront of defending democracy abroad, and we need to continue to support the Ukrainians in this fight.
Thank you.
Moving on to a different topic, Ms. Pettersen, you helped pass Colorado's abortion access law that does not put any restriction on abortion. Would you try to pass a similar federal law allowing abortion at any time for any reason?
Thank you, Marshall. I'm proud of what we did here in Colorado to protect access to reproductive health care and ensure that this choice is between women and their doctors. The reason why there aren't restrictions is because, as you know, those later abortions come with medical emergencies. Doctors and women need to be protected in that circumstance. We need to make sure that we're not protecting just the rights here in Colorado, but protecting that at the federal level. I've done so here in Colorado, and I will absolutely do so at the federal level.
Should federal taxpayer dollars be used to fund abortions?
I think that that this is something that tries to bring division around funding for abortion. I think that this is healthcare, that this should be funded no matter who the payer.
That's a yes then?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Aadland, you said you support Texas's abortion ban, which would give the right of any state to do as they please. Still, if a state decides to jail women for having abortions and jail any friends or family who help them obtain an abortion, you're comfortable with that?
Well, that's not what I said. I said I support a state's rights decision. So Texas's right to choose, Colorado's right to choose. I've also said I will not support any federal legislation whatsoever to ban or to promote abortion. I'll uphold the Hyde Amendment. But this is a state's level decision, and I'm focused on Colorado. And I'm not going to do anything as your next representative to address this issue. I think the federal government needs to stay out of it altogether. And I think what we have here is a very extreme and permissive bill on par with North Korea and China. I don't think most pro-choice voters here in Colorado understand how permissive and extreme this bill really is. Abortion up to the day of birth. I can't support that personally, but I'm not going to do anything as a congressman. I'm going to stay out of it and let Colorado decide through the legislative process.
So states like Texas that are more restrictive about people accessing that care or friends of them, you're okay with it because the state chose that?
Well, I'm not looking at Texas. I'm not going to intervene in Texas. I'm allowing Texas to make its own laws because that's where it should be. I might have issues with the extremeness of Texas's bill, but I'm focused here on Colorado, and this is the bill I'm looking at.
So what about states criminalizing out-of-state travel? So someone coming from Texas to Colorado and then going after them because they came here?
I think that's extreme. I think that's problematic.
Why?
Well, I think it's a gross overreach of power between interstate compacts. Ultimately, the federal government needs to stay out of that. And I want to remind the listening audience, I'm running for Congress, so I'm focused on the federal issues. I'm a limited government person. I want to reduce federal government intervention. And I do think that what you've stated about Texas is a bit extreme. That's not something I would support.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Aadland.
Do you want to be heard on this issue? Go ahead.
I just want to clarify that my opponent will not protect those rights at the federal level, and also doesn't support the law that we passed protecting those rights here in Colorado. And so he supports states like Texas being able to throw women and doctors in prison for up to life for making this healthcare decision. It's really easy to talk about an extreme law with no exceptions. There are people who are going through medical emergencies where they're bleeding to death trying to go across state lines for the care that they need because of the radical Supreme Court decision.
So, in the end of the day, you've said that you're not going to be weighing in one way or the other on this in Congress. If Republicans take the House, that's not going to be your choice. It's going to be the choice of your party leadership. And if they were to put up an abortion ban similar to the one being promulgated in the Senate by Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, how would you vote on that? You'd have to vote.
I would vote against it.
You would vote
I've made
against
that commitment to my constituents. I'm not going to weigh in at the federal level. And I think Mrs. Pettersen is misstating me. I have been very clear that I support Colorado's ability to decide through the legislative process, and I'm not going to interfere with that. And I don't weigh in on Texas because I'm representing Colorado in District 7. I'm running for Colorado.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Aadland, you have falsely claimed that the 2020 presidential election was rigged. Let's listen to that.
The 2020 election, it was rigged. Absolutely rigged. If you do enough looking into it, I think you'll be convinced.
That claim that the election was rigged is false, and it's also dangerous. That lie led people to storm the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. It led to the deaths of Americans. That lie has also led to death threats against election workers here in Colorado, ongoing threats to people's lives. Should that false claim, that dangerous claim, disqualify you in the eyes of voters?
Well, I think your statement is a bit extreme, Kyle, and I don't think that to make it a black or white issue with something so complex and nuanced is justice to the issue. I've called into question, just like Hillary Clinton and Stacey Abrams and hundreds of Democrat legislators did in the 2016 elections, that our elections are secure. But in every speech, including this one, I talk about looking forward. I haven't asked that we overturn the 2020 elections. This is not about President Trump, who I make this about a concern for the American citizens and the integrity of our constitutional republic. And this should be a nonpartisan issue, that we have a dialogue. And your rhetoric, in fact, makes it very hard for us to have a dialogue that comes to the solution that makes our election secure.
Well, pointing out the fact that the claim is false is not rhetoric. That's just a fact. Pointing out that it's gotten people killed is also just a fact. You additionally said that the election had been undermined by fraud, corrupted, and we now have an illegitimate government in power. You believe that we have an illegitimate government in power?
I've nuanced my perspective and my statements, recognizing the divisiveness of that language. So I've evolved. I'm not a politician. I started that speech I gave was the first speech I gave in the U.S. Senate race, and I recognize the divisiveness of that language.
Have you changed your beliefs, or have you just stopped saying it out loud because it's gotten you in trouble?
No, I don't think this is a partisan issue. I've acknowledged that Biden is the legitimate president, and I'm looking forward. What can we do in a nonpartisan way to restore trust in the institution of our elections? We do have to get away from divisive rhetoric. I've become much more savvy and sensitive to my constituents, and tens of millions of Americans have concerns about the elections. So it's the question of what are we going to do to restore that confidence? We have to move beyond the divisiveness, the hatred, the vitriol, but it's not just Republicans. Both parties have called into question the integrity of our elections, and it's problematic. So what are we going to do about it?
And just to clear this up, you do or you do not believe that America has an illegitimate government in power? I know you've stopped saying it, but do you believe it?
No, I don't know if there was enough fraud or if there were enough issues. The cover-up of the Hunter Biden laptop has me deeply concerned. That alone could have thrown out, or changed the course of the election.
That's different than a rigged election.
Well, we could call that an aspect of rigged, but I don't know. It's too complex for me to get down. What it does is there's enough concern for us to work together and to make sure these elections are secure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Aadland. Ms. Pettersen?
To compare Hillary Clinton talking about access to voting rights and what we need to do to fix our system to Trump and what he did to try to overthrow the government with a violent insurrection is just completely out of line. We are looking to the future right now. We need people who are not conspiracy theorists and election deniers, who are going to support our Constitution and vote to vote for whoever wins in 2024. We need confidence that the people running across the country are going to put our democracy first.
One last question on this before we move on. If you lose this race, will you accept the result?
Yes.
If you lose this race, will you accept the result?
I will accept it, yes.
Thank you.
And may I respond?
Honestly, we've heard quite a bit on this issue, so I want to make sure we can get to some other things. Ms. Pettersen, you tout your record on fighting the opioid crisis, and part of that record was your advocacy for Denver to create a supervised drug injection site, which is a place where people who use injectable drugs could go to get high under medical supervision. That idea got tremendous public pushback, and even your fellow Democrats abandoned it. Let's listen to what you told me in 2019.
We have people who are already using. If we don't create this site, they're going to be in the parks, in the alleys, in the public bathrooms. It doesn't stop use.
So my question is, do you still believe that supervised drug injection sites are a good idea, and would you support similar efforts at the federal level?
Thank you for the question, Kyle. We know that this is evidence-based. It would save lives. It's irrelevant in this race, but it's something that the doctors, the experts here in Colorado brought us what we can do to prevent overdose deaths when we're in this opioid epidemic and crisis. Unfortunately, it's been used as a political weapon. And so because stigma is the biggest barrier that we face to getting people the help that they need, it's why I didn't bring the bill, and it's why I don't think that they should actually address it at the state level. And so it would save lives for that pilot program for the people who have access, but it does detrimental damage for our ability to come together and reduce the stigma for people who are struggling with addiction.
So if I heard you right, you said that it's irrelevant in this race, your previous support for, or your continued support for supervised injection sites?
It's not something that it would be relevant at the federal level.
And why is that? Because you don't think that the federal government has any role to play in terms of that part of the opioid crisis? Explain that.
Yeah, this was something around a state law that would have taken away the rights of, if you had a site like this, that you could actually lose property rights, and it was just addressing that for one pilot program. This is not something that has anything to do with the seat that I'm running for, but it's something that would save lives. Unfortunately, it's been used as a political weapon.
Would you support federal funding for supervised injection sites in communities that choose that?
No.
Mr. Aadland?
Well, that's interesting because President Biden has proposed exactly that same thing, federal funding for clean injection sites and the distribution of drug paraphernalia. So I'm glad to hear that my opponent wouldn't support such a naive proposal, because enabling addiction does not solve the root of this problem. So I wonder what my opponent thinks would solve this opioid epidemic. You know, the fentanyl crisis we're experiencing here in Colorado, especially given that she worked to reduce the penalties for fentanyl distribution from a felony to a misdemeanor.
In just a moment, you'll have an opportunity to ask each other a question, so feel free to bring that back up again. But first, I want to ask you about the idea of defunding law enforcement, because both of you have called for defunding law enforcement in different ways. Ms. Pettersen, you signed a letter last year urging President Biden to, quote, divest from immigration enforcement agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol. How would defunding ICE and Border Patrol make Americans safer?
Thanks for bringing that up. That's broad language, so it can be made out to be anything. So what I support is making sure that we secure our border, but we look strategically at the investments that we're making. And we look at two criteria when we're doing that. Is this the best use of dollars? Is this the most efficient way that we're going to do this? And is this a humane policy? So for example, right now, people wait up to 12 hours in line as they go across the border to have their cars, the commercial and personal cars looked at. We know that we can actually bring screening so that we can quickly identify people and drugs being trafficked over the border. This will also address some of our supply chain issue. It's also, I don't support funding the cruel border policies of separating families. There's hundreds of kids that don't know where their parents are. And I don't support targeting law-abiding immigrants here in Colorado. I think that we need to be focused on criminals.
And you told President Biden that taking money away from border security is the way to do that, to achieve those aims. You signed that letter. It's the rest of the letter that is really important to me. There are things that I don't support in funding. Well, but that's what you told the president to do. You instructed him. You signed a letter that said you should divest from immigration enforcement agencies.
That was the end of the letter. That was part of it. And I just talked about the things that I don't think that we should be funding. And I think that blindly funding and not having scrutiny and oversight leads to government fraud and abuse. And that's what we've seen.
Mr. Aadland, you said that you talked with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy about defunding state and local prosecutors if they exercise their prosecutorial discretion in a way that you guys don't like. How would defunding prosecutors make Americans safer?
Well, right now we have lawlessness in Colorado. We're leading the nation in auto theft. We're leading the nation in bank robberies. We're the cocaine capital of the country. Violent crime is up over 30% here in Colorado. This is a result of not enforcing the law and soft on crime policies that my opponent has directly supported. So what Congress can do is make sure that federal funding goes to the right places and use the power of the purse as pressure to make sure that the rule of law is upheld. Now, I never would support defunding the police. We need to make sure that law enforcement is well-funded, resourced, and trained. And we have to restore the integrity that was lost because the Democrats push to defund the police. This is very problematic. We must address crime at its root, and that's upholding the law.
So explain to me how it's bad to defund the police, but you've called for defunding the prosecutors who prosecute the cases that police bring them.
We need to make sure that prosecutors enforce the law, and we need to put pressure on them to do so, using the federal means to make sure that our streets are safe. And right now, attorney generals and prosecutors across the nation are, with their soft on crime policies, not doing their job. We have to put pressure on the state level governments to make sure that laws are enforced and upheld.
Lastly, would you name a city or county in Colorado whose prosecutors you would defund?
Well, I think that Denver needs to be looked at closely. We've got out-of-control homelessness, as mentioned, and we are number 2 in the nation for fentanyl overdose deaths. We're not enforcing the law. And auto theft is a major impact on the cost of hardworking families.
Thank you, Mr. Aadland.
Sometimes the best part of the debate is a question we didn't come up with because we maybe weren't smart enough to come up with it. Ms. Pettersen, you have a question for Mr. Aadland?
Did Trump lose the 2020 election? Yes or no?
Yes, he lost the 2020 election. Biden is the president. I mean, we have out-of-control inflation, rising crime, an unsecure border, unprecedented global instability. Biden's clearly the president.
Mr. Aadland, your question for Ms. Pettersen.
As a father, I'm really concerned about this fentanyl crisis. Chinese fentanyl is coming across the southern border in epic proportions. And it is a significant epidemic here in Colorado. You supported a 2019 bill to reduce the penalties for fentanyl distribution from a felony to a misdemeanor. You also signed a letter asking Biden to defund border control agents and make our border porous. I mean, how do you justify such a naive proposition?
I am deeply concerned about the opioid epidemic, and I look forward to working with you to address this. This is something that I have dedicated 7 years of my career fighting to lead the nation on policies to increase access to treatment and recovery services. I am, this is a devastating situation, and fentanyl has taken over the drug supply chain across the country and across the globe. This is not a Colorado issue. We're 33rd in the nation for fentanyl overdose deaths and 29th for overdose deaths in general. But we have a lot of work to do. I saw firsthand what happens when people who are struggling with addiction, how decimated our system is and the lack of access to treatment and recovery services when I was fighting to save my mom's life. She struggled with addiction for 30 years, and ultimately fentanyl started coming in when she was addicted to heroin. She started overdosing at a high rate. She overdosed 20 times the last day that she was the last year that she was struggling with addiction.
I want to bring in our colleague Anusha Roy for one question that you'll see and hear on the monitors here about mental health.
Kids are showing up in the emergency room during a mental health crisis, and healthcare workers are saying too often they're running out of options and they don't have anywhere to send families for all levels of mental health care. Is it the federal government's responsibility to provide more mental health resources for children? And if so, how would you pay for it?
Ms. Pettersen, we'll start with you.
So I've worked alongside the Children's Hospital on some of these issues in transforming our behavioral health system. This is something that is deeply concerning when we have kids that are being sent across our state borders to other states to have access to the critical mental health care that they need. I lost my brother to suicide. This is something that is deeply personal to me in the failures in our system here. So the federal government has a responsibility to make sure that we bring parity around funding. We have a parity law around supporting mental health care the same as physical health care, but it's actually a complaint-based system and it's really ineffective. So we need to bring double down on our investment to help states like Colorado with limited funding options.
Thank you, Ms. Pettersen. Mr. Aadland, mental health resources for kids, how are we paying for it?
Yeah, it's one of my deep concerns. So I had left my corporate job. I was pursuing a PhD to become a counselor to work with veterans and trauma victims. And I think we are a traumatized society. We're seeing that in the result of gun violence. We're seeing that in the result of the suicide rate, especially among veterans. We have to find a way to fund mental health services because that's the core of so many of the problems we're seeing in society, especially in our school system. We need great resources so that kids feel reconnected, they feel heard, they feel like they have an outlet other than drugs or violence or alcohol or other things that are contributing to all the problems we're seeing in our society. Now this as your next congressman is I've got to look at the budget. How do we fund it? I don't know. I'm not sure yet. We've got to figure that out. And it is a matter of right-sizing the government because we can't continue to spend our way out of problems. So states may have to assume some of this burden.
Okay, Mr. Aadland, thank you.
Thank you both for a very respectful conversation. We've maybe squeezed in an extra minute or two, but that's how it works. Each candidate will now have a 1-minute closing statement to voters. We determined via coin toss earlier. Mr. Aadland, you'll go first.
So Erik Aadland, running to be your next representative. My name's an odd name with 2 A's. Just remember that. That's how you pronounce it. I'm a combat veteran, a West Point graduate, tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 for valor. Put my life on the line for this country because I love this country. I love Colorado. I have 3 beautiful children. And right now, everything is going wrong. We have out of control inflation. We have rising crime here in Colorado. We've got significant problems, including unprecedented global instability that must be addressed through sound leadership. I want to bring my combat experience and then a decade of experience in the energy sector running businesses all over the world to solving these tough problems so that my children have a brighter future. Your children have a brighter future. I never endeavored to be a politician. This was not in the cards. I'd retire to the mountains of pine because I wanted peace. I'd had enough of war, enough of conflict. But in this time of crisis, we need sound leaders who will do the right for all constituents and heal the divisiveness in this country. Thank you.
Mr. Aadland, thank you. Ms. Pettersen.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Marshall, for having me. My name is Brittany Pettersen, and I have been, it's been the honor of my life to serve this community for the last decade. I also never saw myself ever running for office. I got involved because I'm a product of this community. I grew up in Jefferson County. I was a high-risk youth and I faced a lot of obstacles at home, but I was given a chance to build a better life. Because of the investments that this community made in me, I became the first in my family to graduate from high school and college and went a much different path than I was likely to go. And that's why coming out of college, I started working for candidates that I believed in because I know firsthand that the people who are elected can make or break it for regular people like me. So I dedicated the last decade serving the community to level the playing field, invest in our public schools, increasing access to early childhood education, making sure that we reduce costs for health insurance premiums. And there's so much, I'm already running out of time, but really quick, I want to thank my husband for all of his support, my son Davis for always reminding me why I do this every day, and my mom for being willing to tell her story to try to save lives here in Colorado.
Thank you, State Senator Brittany Pettersen. Thank you, Erik Aadland, for a respectful conversation. We appreciate your time. This is the 4th in an unprecedented series of 6 debates that are being televised on 9 News this election year. Debates in Colorado's most closely contested congressional races, as well as the U.S. Senate, and all of the statewide races, with the exception of the governor's race. Democratic Governor Jared Polis agreed to debate here, but his Republican challenger Heidi Ganahl declined. For the full schedule of debates and a link to a video of this full debate, text the word debate to 303-871-1491. We'll text you back with the full debate schedule and the video of tonight's debate that you can share with others. Our next debate is Monday, October 24th in the race for Secretary of State. That debate between Democratic Secretary of State Janet Griswold and Republican challenger Pam Anderson will air as part of Next at 6 p.m. on 9 News on Monday. For Marshall Zellinger and Anusha Roy and our whole team at 9 News, I'm Kyle Clark. Thanks for watching.